God answered my prayer,
Yeah.
and he didn't have to, but he
Yeah.
did.
We talked recently about you had been doing some reading about the idea of suffering
Hmm.
and how some of the things you've been going through personally actually help you to connect with the community you lived in. I'm not sure how comfortable you are with, sharing maybe the last 6, 7, 8 years. Um that's not necessarily connected to where you live, but it's connected to your humanity.
Hmm.
Um and how you have, I say, thrived because I look at you and I listen to you and I know what you've been dealing with.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. In 2016, I found out I had breast cancer. That was a pretty tough couple of years going through that. And then in 2019, basically, I came to the end of oh gosh, a 28-year marriage, probably. And so my husband moved out in the beginning of 2020, like January 1st of 2020. Prior to that, my daughter had graduated high school and went to Santa Barbara, was there for a year. And in the fall of 2018, after 2 weeks in school, developed mono and ended up getting incredibly sick and coming home. And that virus completely disabled her. And between that and then the trauma of my husband and I's marriage ending and just specific details around that, my daughter, who was voted, she went to Mayfair High School, which is large. She was voted most likely to change the world in her senior class. And her, she's feisty. She became completely disabled and is homebound and was not able to go back to college, has still not been able to return. And we've been on a journey ever since then of trying to figure out, how to get her well. Then my husband moved out, like I said, and then the pandemic came, and I had a child with no functioning immune system in the middle of a global pandemic and a marriage that had just ended. And that was the marriage ending was a big surprise to my kids. So there was just a ton of trauma in a very short amount of time right after coming out of cancer. And our world blew up, and then right after that the whole world blew up in terms of the pandemic. So navigating that, trying to help them. I said at the time that it was a lot like the Titanic, and it felt like, off in the distance was the ship burning and going into the ocean. And I had found this little piece of flotsam that my kids and I were holding on to, just trying to stay afloat. And it was like that for a few years. And and again, everybody was hurting. So that was a plus and a minus. On one hand, it was a great gift that the world shut down and we could just be here together, the three of us, and mourn and grieve and get our feet under us. And at the same time, it meant everybody was going through hell. And so there wasn't a lot of bandwidth for anybody to help anybody else, in terms of the kind of crisis that we were going through. But we had a small community of folks, and you don't need a lot, that were very committed to us and walking with us. And we had Jesus, and he was, he stands, and he
Mhm.
has stood and surrounded us and walked us through it. And we're not out of the woods, I would say, in terms of like for my kids especially, but there's a stabilization now. I think we're stable. My daughter's health, she's taken some turns and twists. She actually has been doing a lot better, and 2 times gotten COVID, and it's been devastating for her. And so we're finally seeing, actually in the last month, she's had some of the best weeks she's had since 2021 when she got COVID. But yeah, it's been a lot. It's been a lot for sure. But in terms of the community, that what I say is, even in getting cancer, the reason why I've known how to navigate all these things is because years ago my community taught me what it looked like to suffer, and to not give up and crawl in a hole, but to still find meaning and purpose in life and love and laughter. I learned that here.
Right.
I look constantly at I'm surrounded by people who, again, have all these odds, and have so many things in the world that are set against them, and yet they persevere and they love each other and they, have families and still have hopes and dreams and laugh together and, have parties and mariachi music and, just all the things. And it's beautiful, and it's shaped how, what I value and how I define suffering. I think, a lot of, I don't feel entitled to not having issues in my life. I never have. That's kind of not how I was raised, but I think a deeper level of understanding that happened being here.
So you're talking about what you learned about the community. What did you learn about Tanya? And what are you learning about Tanya?
Um, I I have always been a person that God's given me a deep value for who I am. And I think years ago, there were certain challenges and things where I felt like God was always calling me to work on myself. And I got tired of it sometimes. Like, why does it all have to be me? And what the Lord has shown me is just his incredible grace, because I worked on myself for years and knew that the only person I could really develop was me. And so then when the world blew up, all that hard work that God had poured into me and all that development was there. And I have not felt like a weak person. I would have said I was strong 6 years ago, but I think being able to see how strong, and it's hard because that really is dependent on him. Like, I'm strong, but I'm strong because of what he has given me and what he does in me. At the same time, how I've walked through all this matters to me. The example I set matters to me. And I am so grateful that I can look back at that young, not so young, but, young woman, young woman who had a whole lot of hopes and dreams that all blew up big time a few years ago, and how petrified I was. There were a few years when I knew what was coming, and I was so scared and I lived in so much fear. And yet, man, God just, at every step, he was there. And so to see the freedom that he's brought me and the way that he's walked me through it, and the faithfulness and the provision and the things that he's done to get me and my kids to this point, I'm so grateful that I can hold my head high about the way that I've handled it and the way I've behaved. And at the same time, I'm so humbled by the way that none of my worst fears, all my worst fears came true, and then none of my worst fears came true.
And you're still here.
And I'm better.
You're better.
I'm better.
And you kind of answered this a little bit, but if you can expand on what you learned about God.
Oh man. I started saying years ago, my favorite, I have a few favorite scriptures, but probably one that really has carried me through for years is Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the depth of how true that is, I cannot comprehend it. His faithfulness. I remember the day that I knew that my marriage was going to end, I met with a friend nearby in the park, and she didn't know it was coming. And so as I shared with her, and my kids didn't know at that point it was coming, and as I met with her, poured out my heart and shared with her all these fears that I had, she told me a story about a woman that she'd heard years before at a retreat who had gone through something similar. And now at this retreat was just sharing how at every turn God met her and did all these things that she couldn't possibly believe, like that she heard the testimony of his faithfulness. I cannot believe, I can't even recall the testimony. And I mean, in 2020, like there were beyond, all hell broke loose. We had a rat infestation in the garage. We're just one after another that happened. And yet God just surrounded us and held us up, and we laughed and we cried and we laughed and we cried. It was absurd how crazy it was. So I don't think that I learned new things about him. I think that I have just experienced them at such a deeper level. I have learned that he and I together really are enough. And at times, especially with things happening with my son and with my kids, there have just been things that I did not feel strong enough adequate enough to walk through. My daughter's had 2 surgeries in the last couple years that were emergency surgeries. My son has gone through so much. When my marriage ended, my husband left, my son could not even drive and he was 20. We had not had the money for him to get a license because we couldn't afford insurance. And then he was graduating and it was time. And all of a sudden I had no one to teach him to drive. And it's 2020. And so you can't even get in a car with people that aren't in your immediate household. And I am not the person to teach anyone to drive. Nobody wants to learn to drive for me, and I don't want to teach anybody. And that was agonizing for me as a responsible parent. How in the world, Lord, how is this going to happen? There were so many things like that where it's like, I am in this all by myself, as much as people were around us. At the end of the day, it was me and Jesus. And that has been enough. That has been more than enough. So he has surprised me with the things that he has walked me through that I've been able to handle and navigate. That I got married very young too. So there were a lot of things that I had not done independently that my friends who didn't get married young had, and, here we are, here we are. So
What are you hopeful for? What's the future hold for Tanya?
I'm not sure, honestly. I think so much of life has been survival for the last few years that it's, there's not a lot of room for looking super far ahead. I am hopeful for my kids, probably the most, and the young people that I work with, just seeing them be able to thrive and grow into who God created them to be. I'm hopeful that my daughter will be able to live independent someday. I'm also aware, as is she, that may not be the case. And so in that case, I'm hopeful of how God will walk us through that, like he's walked us through everything else. I think there is a sense that I've had the last few years, again, that I'm living in freedom that I didn't have before. And so that alone has been a lot to just process and experience and be grateful for. And to some degree, to be honest, because I can be fearful, I have to discipline myself from thinking too much about the future, especially with my daughter. She just turned 25, and God has done a mighty work in her to be able to live in the condition that she's living. People who have what she have, death by suicide is very common with them, because it's really hard to be, any age, but especially her age, and be basically stuck in a bedroom, for the majority of the time. And so I have to really discipline myself to not go down the, how am I going to provide for her? How am I going to provide for myself? How is, what if something happens to me, where, all that. No, one day at a time. Again, same yesterday, today, and forever. You've never let us down. You've never left us. That's not going to change. So I just have to, one foot in front of the other, and keep trusting him with that.
Anything you'd like to add or share before we end?
Can't think of anything.
Okay.
I think the only thing that I might want to say that's very practical ministry wise is one of the things in terms of adjustment to ministry that I think is true, because this goes across race, color, all of it. I wish I would have understood at a younger point in my journey the impact of poverty